Well, welcome back to Truth is Lacking. I'm sitting down again with my friend, Dr. Marcus Ross. If you didn't catch the last video that we did, I encourage you to take a look at that. We cover a lot of information within that, and it's looking at, is the beginning chapters of Genesis reasonable from a scientific point of view? And Dr. Ross interacts with many fields of science, working these things out. Is it reasonable? And he brings up some very valid arguments, but most importantly, the humility that we should bring as Christians, regardless of our expertise, to interaction with people that might believe differently than us. As ultimately, our goal is to not prove somebody wrong, but the goal is to be used by the Holy Spirit to reach people and to share the gospel with them. Today, I want to look at something with you, picking up from our conversation from last time, but looking at this idea, does the geological record pose any sort of difficulty for the evolutionary theory? When I was in school, I always heard this concept that geology was really what seals the deal. And you look at geology, and you mentioned prior as well that with the radioactive decay, with these different things, when you look at geology, it's clearly evident that to make all of these layers in the rock would have taken millions and millions of years. This is the ace in the hole. This proves evolutionary theory through and through. But as a paleontologist, with the interplay of all these different fields of science that you have had to study, that you've had to go through, does geology pose any sort of difficulty for evolutionary theory?
Yeah, it poses both opportunities and challenges for both evolutionary views, or what I'd prefer to think of in terms of old Earth views. Because one of the things for us to consider is that an old Earth or an old age to the Earth is actually an independent question compared to evolution. So in the history of geology, if you go back to, say, the 1600s and even the early 1700s, from that point back through towards Jesus and beyond, there was never any question within the church or within Judaism really about what the age of the Earth is. Everybody kind of assumed that the Earth was only a few thousands of years old, that Noah's flood was a global event, Adam and Eve were the first two people, et cetera, et cetera. You know, the kind of a straightforward reading of the biblical text indicated that was the history of things. It's in the mid-late 1700s that people studying geology in particular start to think that, you know, maybe they can't explain all the world's geology through such a straightforward reading of the text. They think that maybe there were worlds before Adam and Eve. And so you come up in the early 1800s with a few theological arguments to address what the geologists now seem to be saying, that the Earth is very ancient. All of that happens before Darwin. So Darwin writes The Origin of Species and publishes it in 1859. And what Darwin did is he said that evolutionary theory explains the pattern of the life forms that we find in the rock record.
Okay.
And in an ancient Earth context.
That's the point of distinction, yeah.
Where the idea of an ancient Earth was already very well established. So he's coming along later and saying there's a biological and a naturalistic biological explanation for the patterns that people saw in the fossil record that prior to Darwin they had usually argued was evidence of the separate creation of different types of organisms over time. So for young Earth creationists, we think that God created all the different plants and animals and groups in the week of creation. The old Earth creationists were thinking mostly in terms of multiple creations over long, long periods of time. And by the time Darwin was writing, the idea of a young Earth and a global flood had largely been jettisoned, at least by the intelligentsia, at least by the academic class, of both the science side and a lot of the theology side. So in that case, then, evolution didn't predict the pattern of fossils in the rock record, at least not initially.
Okay.
It offered itself as an explanation for it.
Okay, got it.
So that's a different way than what we're usually presented.
Absolutely,
in
yeah.
School. You know,
That's
we're told that
evolution
predicts this pattern.
Yeah.
Evolution actually said no. You know, Darwin said no. I'm going to explain the pattern. And Darwin's book was largely about that. He sampled. I mean, the book is big. It's 600 plus pages. There's only 2 pictures. For a science book, that's disappointing. But Darwin referred to his book as one long argument because he pulled from domestic breeding and study of natural populations, studies of geology, studies from all sorts of different things to kind of coalesce around his idea of evolution by natural selection. But getting then to your question, are there arguments and evidences against this ancient view of the geological record? There are, and there are arguments from that. There's reasons why people think the Earth is ancient and why they are skeptical of a young Earth view. So there's strong challenges to those.
Certainly.
As well. And as you mentioned, radioactive dating, which is done on not all the different rocks in the geological column, but on particular ones. Radioactive dating works for igneous rocks like lava flows and granites and volcanic deposits. It also works for metamorphic rocks that have been baked and heated and squished, and they kind of get their clocks reset and they start over with radioactive dating. The rocks that have the fossils in them themselves, the sedimentary rocks like limestone or shale or sandstone, generally speaking, we don't use radioactive decay on those as a method because those rocks are way too complicated as open systems. There's way too much coming in and out of those rocks for them to be a locked-in little time capsule. So that's why other types of rocks are used. So if somebody wants to say, for example, that dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago, what they're doing is looking at the last fossils of dinosaurs and then looking at what's believed to be the impact material from the asteroid that hit the Yucatan Peninsula. That has a reset clock in it, and so they're going to date that. Anything underneath that has got to be older. Anything above that has got to be younger. Right?
Okay.
So
okay.
It's a reasonable method. It's a good method, I would say, as a relative indicator. I have no problems with this as a geologist and as a young Earth creationist. That whatever's underneath this layer has got to be older than it, whatever's above it.
Yeah.
Because
that's
it's like,
reasonable.
Yeah, it's like a stack of pancakes or the messy office that my wife just helped clean up because before you got here,
I was going to say, this is quite tidy.
it was not tidy. My four-dimensional filing system, of which you got various levels of depth, but you have to then think about time. And like, okay, so where did I see this last? How far in the pile is it?
That's so true.
Geologists, basically, like me, paleontologists and people who work with sedimentary rocks, we think that way all the time. The lower you go, the older you go. The higher you go, the younger it is. So particular challenges to an ancient age of the Earth. Let's say, for example, we're looking at organisms that are supposed to have evolved over time. And in a break, we were talking a bit about these before. Mm-hmm. Fossilizing a bone or a shell or a tooth or other things that we call the hard parts, right? The body fossils of animals is a lot easier to do. It's not to say that fossilization is easy, but if you're going to fossilize something, the hard things are the things that get fossilized the most. And if we're by the side of the road, as I am, hitting a rock, right? Or you're... I was at a hotel in St. Louis a couple of months ago, and behind that was just this beautiful cut rock of limestone that they just blasted out of the way to make the hotel. So I went around the back of the hotel
to go
look, and there's fossils everywhere. I mean, it was just chock full of all sorts of marine invertebrate fossils. There were shells, there were corals or branch things.
That's so cool.
It was great, right? And here I am. I've got my carry-on luggage, and I can't take a big old rock with me. It'll exceed the weight limit, and then I got to pay for it to come back. But anyway, so we're looking at those. Those are the sorts of things that we usually think about for fossils. We go to a museum because we want to see skeletons and stuff.
Yeah.
So those are easy to fossilize, and we use those oftentimes as the first appearance to mark when a new organism is supposed to have evolved, right? Yes. So an evolutionist will say, this is the first appearance, and so this is the at least when this thing evolved. Maybe it evolved before that, we don't have any fossils of it, but at least by this point we know it's around, therefore it evolved, and then we follow its fossil record on up until the last time we see it, and at that point, it's gone extinct, or maybe a little bit after that it goes extinct, but we don't have the fossils. So these things that we call first and last appearances are important for us in geology because they're giving us the minimum first appearance, the minimum first time and the minimum last time to see things. So when we're looking at things like evolution, let's think of an example of a big evolutionary transition that would make me uncomfortable as a creationist. a transition from a fish-like animal into an amphibian, a four-legged creature that's able to get out onto the land and walk around, even if it has to come back to the water. To go from gills to lungs and things like that seems like a lot. As a young Earth creationist, that seems like two different kinds of animals, whatever those kinds are. They seem different. So the evolutionary argument for this is that a variety of different types of fish eventually evolved the features to become amphibians and then took off to the land. And then from those amphibians, eventually some of them evolved into reptiles and so on and so forth. And they're going to say, all right, well, we've got a good transition of these fish that look like they almost have legs to fish that have almost even better legs to ones that might even have some sort of lung structure. And then we have our first amphibians. And so we got this beautiful transition in the fossil record with a whole bunch of names that you have never seen, that never get into Jurassic World because nobody wants to talk about Ichthyostega and Acanthostega and Tiktaalik and a bunch of other things. I know them. I think they're cool fossils, but you would look at it like it's a fish that's sitting in a pond, not moving very much either. You're like, yep.
Where's the excitement?
It's kind of like a catfish, only very much not like a catfish.
Not going to make a movie that way.
Probably not even going to be all that tasty. So my evolutionary colleagues are like, hey, we've got the right sort of fish before these other fish, before these amphibians. The trajectory looks really good. And they've even predicted where they should go to find more fossils to help fit in there. And they go out to places like some island in Canada that's actually closer to Greenland because they know that there's rocks there that just might have the right things. And they end up finding fossils that fit in this system. That's a good prediction. I mean, if you're willing to predict, I've got to go out to northern Canada.
Yeah, no kidding. That's
to
pretty
look
specific.
in certain rocks to get a particular type of fossil, and you do. That's a win right there. That's a confirmed hypothesis.
Yes.
So then they'll say, hey, listen, you creationists, game, set, match, right?
You can't do this.
This works. And so one of these creatures called Tiktaalik, which was called a fishapod, like a fish tetrapod. It looked like it was in between fish and land-dwelling animals.
Okay.
Was described in 2005 or 2006, and it's a strong challenge to creationist arguments that there's distinct kinds. And I just had to sit there and deal with that, right? People poking fun at me and stuff like that. Hey, it looks good. I have to admit, you guys, you got to, I'll at least say it was game, set and matched. We're not done yet, but you got a good game on that one. In 2009, there was a discovery of a set of footprints from these tetrapods, these land-dwelling early amphibian types of critters from Poland. And what was fascinating about the discovery of these amphibian tracks is they weren't found after the first amphibians, which is what you'd expect, right? The bones are easy to fossilize, but footprints, not easy to fossilize, right? You walk on the beach.
They're gone. They're washed away.
You have no footprints.
They deteriorate quickly.
Even on a muddy day on campus, right?
Yeah.
You walk around and you leave some footprints. They're not sticking around.
No.
But every once in a while, we do get footprints and we get trackways and traces and things like that. And so this team working in Poland discovered trackways of early tetrapods. But they weren't after the first tetrapods. They were before them. You think, well, okay, maybe you were lucky. But they were before the potential ancestors to those trackways, the Tiktaalik.
Oh,
and they were before the ancestors of the Tiktaalik that don't look as much like the tetrapods. They were 30 million years before the tetrapods, and they were 15 million years before the presumed ancestors of the tetrapods.
That poses a problem.
That does, because now what you've got is what I like to call the Back to the Future problem, right? Is Marty McFly is now back in 1955, before he's born, talking with his dad.
Yes.
In this case, it would actually be more like he went back in the third one. You and I might remember that, right? He goes back to 1855.
Yes.
And he's like way before any of the McFlys are even around. And you're like, oh my goodness, you can seriously mess up time this way.
Yes.
So what we have here is a fossil that is, in a sense, kind of out of place. It's not where all of its other folks are. It's millions of years before. And this layer that it's found in Poland is supposed to be, at least on the conventional geological approach, very well established and well dated. And it's showing up so much earlier, telling us there had to be tetrapods. You don't make footprints without feet.
Can't get the print without it. Yeah.
Right, yeah. You got to have the feet. And but it's before its immediate ancestors, it's before its great-grandparents, and you think that's really weird. Now, if a creationist argument is simply to point out that there you've got this problem, well, that's well and good, but you're not proposing a reason why the data are in some way in your favor.
Right.
But think about it this way. If Noah's flood is burying organisms and it's advancing through ecosystems and it's going through the oceans first, moving closer to land and then moving onto land, you might have a reason for why you find these organisms in the situations, the positions that you do. You're not going to find a deer in the deep ocean because deer don't live out there and their bones don't get out there. So there was a famous evolutionist who was asked, what would falsify your belief of evolution? And he said a rabbit in the deep levels of the rock, called the Cambrian, because that's only known for having shellfish and things like that. And my rejoinder to that is, well, I wouldn't expect there to be a rabbit in the Cambrian in the flood either, unless Noah's chucking them out of the ark, right? Because the burial of ecosystems is going to follow some type of sequence. Low is going to be destroyed first, and stuff on land high up is going to be destroyed later on. So I don't expect there to be these organisms together. The flood is not going to mix absolutely everything on Earth together into one big pot.
That's an important point to realize, yeah. It's not a tsunami just crashing, per se.
Right.
It's water rising.
That's right. And it's lots and lots of individual tsunamis that are going to clear out an ecosystem, pull it back, and then deposit it onto whatever was deposited before that. So that idea of this happened first, this happened second, this happened third, like I said with the dinosaurs, works in creation views of the flood as well, because it's in the low spots where all the sediment ends up piling in and whatever organisms were brought in with it.
Yes, very good point.
So how does this work within a creation perspective? Well, if animals are attempting to escape the flood, then there might be areas of exposed sediment that they're able to run around on, or pauses in the burial where ones that are real close to the top can kind of scurry out and escape. And that can explain why we have some of these amphibians whose trackways are lower down and therefore before any of the physical bones that we have of them.
Okay.
We've got their runaway tracks.
Wow.
And then later on we find them. In fact, when we think of animal tracks of amphibians, we think of things that have like 5 fingers. These things had like 6 and 7 and 8 fingers. They're bizarre.
Interesting.
Bizarre. They look like big salamander-ish sort of things, but they're not salamanders. They're different.
Oh, wow.
And they even had like 8 fingers and toes. And we find these 8 finger and toe marks in the Polish stuff. And then presumably millions of years later, you've got the actual fossils. That time difference doesn't make any sense in evolution. But it does make sense if we're talking about only days or at most weeks during the fossil record as it's being buried during the flood. So the cool thing is that this is not the only instance where that happens. Trilobites are fossils that we've all seen in gift shops and things like that. They look like those little underwater bugs.
Yes, yep.
And there are hundreds of thousands of species of these. I mean, they're the most prolific group of animals in the fossil record. And the first fossils that we have of those are not their hard body parts, they're always trackways. We find trackways, and then above we find fossils. Or sometimes you get the fossils and there's no tracks, but in the places where there's tracks and fossils, frequently the tracks are before there.
Wow.
And again, you got to have feet to make the footprints.
Yes.
And in order to make these footprints, the trilobites have got to have nice, firm, hard exoskeletons. So it's not a worm type of animal making these trackways. It's definitely something with an exoskeleton.
Yes.
Which can preserve. So, I'd understand if it was a soft-bodied critter that would be hard to actually preserve because there's no hard things, but the trilobites aren't like that. Same thing with dinosaur footprints. We have dinosaur footprints that are found before the actual dinosaurs, and really big meat-eating dinosaur footprints are found tens of millions of years before we have any fossils of really big meat eaters. So again, this seems to make sense if we have animals that are attempting to flee the flood on briefly exposed groups of sediments and are very soon thereafter captured and buried by the next waves of tsunamis that are dragging them and their ecosystem back onto these low points. We have to think of the flood as something that's dynamic. It's not like here's the world and the floodwaters just go up and they just go down. This isn't Winnie the Pooh in the 100-acre wood.
Yes. Yes.
Instead, what we have is something that's lasting an entire year,
Which is important to realize. A lot of times Christians don't read the Bible, and they think of the story of Noah and the flood. It rained for 40 days.
Yeah.
You have the giraffe heads that are sticking out of this cute little boat.
Always have to have
right.
those.
And it's turned into just kind of like this fun fictional Winnie the Pooh type story.
Yeah.
But that's not what the Bible is saying is taking place. That's not even what it remotely is hinting at.
Right. I would say that if you read the flood account for what it actually is, then apart from the crucifixions accounts in the New Testament where we kill Jesus Christ, the flood narrative is the single worst chapter in the Bible, or set of chapters in the Bible. It is the destruction of the entire world, all humanity, everything that has the breath of life, save that which is in the ark. The wickedness and the violence that had corrupted, the Bible uses the term all flesh, kol basar in the Hebrew, that everything had become so corrupted by the metastasizing effect of sin that God wipes the slate entirely clean. And when you read the passages of Genesis 7 and 8, where the flood is happening, if you read them with Genesis 1 in flipping back, read Genesis 8 and read Genesis 1 together, and you will find that the retreat of the floodwaters mirrors the creation account in very precise kinds of ways.
Wow.
They both begin with God's Spirit was over the water, and the Hebrew word for that is ruach. Ruach is also the same Hebrew word for wind or breath. So wind, breath, and spirit are all the same. It's not surprising, right? We breathe out.
Right.
So in Genesis 1, the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters. In Genesis 8, verse 1, God sends a wind over the waters, which had completely covered the world. So if you think about the world at the beginning of creation as this kind of watery, chaotic ball,
what it says,
and at the end of at the high point of the flood, the world is a watery, chaotic ball. God sends His Spirit. God sends His ruach in both cases.
That's amazing.
And we translate them differently because the Hebrew is playing off those identical word similarities.
Excellent point.
And then as you follow it on, you get, the waters stop. That's kind of like separating the waters above from the waters below again in day 2. And then the dry land begins to appear in the 3rd day. The waters recede and the mountains are visible. So you get this flow of it. Keep following. I'm not going to give you all of them. Keep following it and see the similarities as you take a look at what goes on in day 5 and day 6. And then what happens as Noah comes off of the ark, and compare the speech of God to Noah to the speech of God to effectively Adam and Eve, but to people on the 6th day, and your mind is going to get blown. It's like, oh my goodness. And the reason that the Bible is doing this is to let us know that the flood completely destroys the entirety of the world that was created. There is nothing that God made in the first chapter of Genesis that is unaffected, save in part the heavens, which are never mentioned in the second time around. So like the sun and the moon are not affected by the flood directly because they're not on earth.
Yes.
They're not the things that are under the heavens, if you will. But that is one of the reasons why not just the description of the flood is being the waters rising and killing everything. But when you get to how the flood waters go down, it's intended to remind the reader that what you're looking at is the rebirth of creation as a whole, and that Noah and his family begin humanity in the same way, sort of, that Adam and Eve did.
Yeah.
And so those are the sorts of ways that as a young earth creationist, sometimes people will say, well, you guys are just, you have a literalistic view of the Bible, and you're just reading the Bible in English and getting like this surface level view.
Yeah.
Probe the depths of the Bible, and what you find is that these passages in creation and the fall are really trying to get us to understand that the world itself was created in a few days, that Adam and Eve are real people and the first of all humanity. There's nobody else around that looks anything like them, and that the flood is entirely a global event. And so it's not surprising when we jump into the New Testament, as you talked at the very beginning, you alluded to Romans 8, that the world is groaning and is cursed. Yeah, Paul's got that view because of what he sees in Genesis 3.
That's amazing.
Peter has his view of the flood in 1st and 2nd Peter because of what he sees in Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9. Yeah. That the Bible is very consistent over thousands of years difference between when these things are written about.
And we're finding that evidence within the geological record aligns with that.
Yeah.
It's credible. It's not that we need that to affirm the claims that the Scripture makes. There's multiple ways the Scripture affirms its claims that it's making, but this is yet another way. So in geology, we are seeing, in essence, the effects of the flood. We can see this in layers, and we would anticipate. That's phenomenal to think about, that there would be trackways, footprints prior to finding the actual animal. Now, help some of us, if you will, because you use the vernacular of the millions of years in between, and I know you're doing that as a scientist, and interacting within that realm. Why, I guess, how is it appropriate as a Christian, per se, to say millions of years in between these two? So if that caused any to stumble, wait a minute, I thought he said he was a Christian. Why is he saying these millions of years?
Yeah, so as a young Earth creationist in geology, I disagree with the millions of years that are assigned to various events in the geological record. On the other hand, you can't avoid talking about them, because this is what every single paper in geology and paleontology and evolutionary biology is using as reference points. So we can agree to the layering of the geological record, that there's Cretaceous, there's rocks that we call Cretaceous, and we call them Cretaceous because of the types of fossils that are typically found together. T-Rex and Triceratops are found in Cretaceous rocks. We define them by this. Those of you that remember, Allosaurus and Stegosaurus as different types of dinosaurs, we don't find them with T-Rex and with Triceratops. We find them in rocks that we can trace down lower below, and those are in rocks that we assign to what's called the Jurassic. And then there's other dinosaurs that are found in rocks that we assign to the Triassic. And as we go further down, these amphibians and these fish are found in rocks that we assign to things like Devonian or Silurian or Mississippian. So we can use those terms, first off, because they're representing real relationships of rocks and fossils in the world. You really do find them in stacks like pancakes, and there's differences of the pancakes. And so then I'll talk about the millions of years, particularly in this case, to highlight the disjunction that you have between your evolutionary expectation of over this many millions of years we go from fish to amphibians. The problem is that in that same many millions of years and more, you seem to already have an evidence for the amphibians around. So now you've got to draw your evolutionary line of those amphibians further down to match the footprints in their own system, right? In their own system, they've got to say, all right, we got to drop down 30 million years, but you have to do that with all of the ancestors as well.
Everything else.
That you don't have any evidence of. And that's a bit of a problem. Now, in geology, we even call those things ghost lineages. And an expectation that there is an evolutionary connection, that this group or this fossil animal has got to go deeper in time because of some other evidence, but we don't have any evidence of it. And it sounds really weird to do. It's a logical conclusion to make given your premises. Given that evolution must happen, that's the idea, right? The supposition is that evolution is the explanation for all the life around us. If that is non-negotiable, then you have to have something like a ghost lineage to make sense out of the data.
Yeah.
If you're willing to reject the idea of evolution writ large, doesn't mean that there aren't new species that are, within kinds, for example, that we started off with animals that came off of the ark, and from them we have a variety of species within some group. So as a young Earth creationist, I have no problem with there being new species. There's new species of cats from within a cat kind. There's new species of bovines from the bovine group that are new to us, that are different from what was brought on board the ark. But there seem to be some limits to those. But if you don't think that there's any limit to evolution, then you're going to have to come up with these patches and fixes to the problem.
Thank you, because that's something that to point out, that as we're having those conversations and using that millions of years, it's appropriate to use that language because it shows a disparity between their system as a whole, and it's not done in this way to say to try to leverage them and say now I've got you in this arm bar, now tap out. It's just to simply show that this disparity is quite great, and if on your own system that you use, this is 15, 30 million years prior to when you suggests that this fossil shows up in this layer of rock, according to the evidence, which is more plausible? And
Right.
so I think it's a great thing to to recognize. Using that language can highlight how great that disparity is. To be able to ask, which does the evidence more likely lean towards? Which is more probable, if you will? And hopefully that opens up another conversation to continue searching.
Yeah, and it does another thing as well, that it helps the person that you're talking to realize that you've spent some time thinking about the world the way that they do.
That's a good point.
For someone like a young Earth creationist in geology, we're a pretty small minority in the geological community. And in order to communicate with people, at all, sometimes you have to say, all right, well, let's lay down some ground rules. Even if I don't agree with them, I'm going to need this in order to communicate at all.
Yeah.
And we do this in all sorts of other ways.
We truly do, yeah.
In order to just, okay, I can't debate with you on every single point, so let's come to some area of agreement, and therefore we can then talk rationally together about, this particular area of interest.
Have true dialogue
Yeah.
at that point, and it's not just a bickering, banter, fighting back and forth.
Right.
To have true dialogue. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I hope this has been encouraging to you and wrestling out some of these ideas. Like, does geology help establish credibility to the biblical worldview? And I hope that you realize that there actually is a lot of evidence in geology that more likely aligns with what the Bible has to say. And the Bible is credible. The Bible is authoritative. And the Christian has no need to be embarrassed, afraid, or ashamed of the gospel that it proclaims. For we find that God reveals His truth in every subject. So whatever you find yourself called to, whatever subject is of interest of you, you don't have to leave your faith at the door in order to pursue something. In Dr. Ross's life, he's had difficulty going through his training, openly being a creationist, but now he's an expert in his field, and he has mutual respect from his peers around him, even if they believe something entirely different, because he has studied and found himself approved amongst his peers to say this is a legitimate scientist. So forward with you. Whatever field God has called you to, do it with all of your might as though you're honoring God with it, and God will establish your ability to interact within it. You don't have to set your faith to the side in pursuing science, paleontology, geology, of all fields, biology. You don't have to set your faith aside. So I hope this has been encouraging to you. Pass it along to a friend. Hit that like button. If you think that this would be beneficial to someone else that you know, please pass it along to them. The purpose is to be able to encourage the faith and have healthy, strong dialogue. Where truth is dispelled from the public square, so is our responsibility to bring truth, to bring God's righteousness into the public square, to be able to dialogue and impact our communities and our societies. Again, hope this has been encouraging. God bless you.